Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 171 of the Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are once again joined by our friend, Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University, right here in St. Paul, Minnesota. Jerrod is also the CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. We are going to continue our series of profiling and providing case studies of infamous serial killers this week by taking a look at the case of Charles Whitman. Now, before you call us on the fact that technically Charles Whitman was not a serial killer, we feel his profile will serve us well nonetheless. As you know, Dr. Brown and I profile these individuals and their histories as a means of sort of reverse engineering their criminal trajectories so as to provide insights as to potential common denominators some of you human service professionals may benefit from. Now, I will allow Dr. Brown to talk more about that as well, but first, for newer listeners who may not yet have had the chance to be educated by Dr. Brown, allow me to briefly introduce him to you. Jerrod Brown, PhD, is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services, with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health and a second emphasis in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies for Concordia University. Jerrod is a friend of the show, so I suspect many of you are aware of his background by now. I'll allow him to provide any additional introductory information on his own. So please, enjoy my conversation with Dr. Brown as we profile the case of Charles Whitman, and I will see you all on the other side. Hello, and welcome back to the show, Jerrod. Thank you for returning to continue this series that you and I have put together in which we profile infamous criminals, not to exploit the crime or anything of that nature, but rather to look at those pathways and precursors into criminality for the purpose of leveraging that knowledge for current practitioners. You are a frequent guest on the show, Dr. Brown, but nonetheless, feel free to introduce yourself to perhaps new-time listeners, and then we are going to do our case profile of Charles Whitman. Jerrod, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Joe, my friend. I always appreciate it. I appreciate all the good work you're doing. And hello, everyone. My name's Jerrod. I am a professor, do a lot of trainings, lots of consultation on a variety of topics with different groups around the country, and do quite a bit of publishing on a number of topics as well. And the topic that I'm really focusing and putting most of my energy into nowadays is neurocriminology, which is a big topic and encompasses all kinds of things we'll talk about. And I know Joe and I have done a lot of talks on that. And we have done a series of talks profiling infamous serial killers. Today, we're taking a little turn. We're going to profile not a serial killer, but one of the first documented mass murders in the United States on college campuses. And his name is Charles Whitman. And probably a lot of people have heard of him. There's been lots of books, discussions, lots of documentaries, movies that have talked about this case. And my goal today is not to excuse anything he did, but maybe putting on our neurocriminology hat and what could have been going on there from a neurological, a biological, a social, and a family lens. Really fascinating case. And I've gone through lots of documentaries on this, lots of newspaper stories, articles. I found a handful of student theses, dissertations that have talked about him, and just pulling it all together to try to make sense of this case a little bit. But what I can say is, after going through all of this, there's a debate in the field still today about the topic of free will came up a lot. We'll talk a little bit about that today. With his case, there's a lot of planning that happened before he actually committed his crimes. So some people believe that he absolutely was 100% responsible for these actions. Some people believe that maybe some of the potential biological or neurological factors that he might have been dealing with may have not excused his actions, but maybe partially shed some light on this. And some people just disagree with it altogether. So a lot of controversy with this case. But before we dig into this, Joe, again, maybe just a brief recap about what is neurocriminology if you're new to this field. So
you read my mind, Jerrod. Why don't we kick it off with just a real brief recap of neurocriminology for those who may not have heard of it, or even the folks who have. It's such a fascinating topic, and you're going to be hearing me talk a lot more about it in the future. So yes, why don't you give a synopsis of what we are talking about when we discuss neurocriminology?
It is an emerging field. There's been more and more studies that talk about this, but in my experience, I don't find a lot of training programs out there, or like college courses or things like that, at least when I do searches online. So not a lot of training out there, in my opinion, for criminal justice, forensic psychological professionals on this topic. It really focuses on understanding the neurobiological factors that could be involved in violent behavior, antisocial behavior, criminal behavior. So it takes basically criminology research and infuses neuroscience research findings into it. So thinking of the brain, the central nervous system, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the HPA axis, all these things we've talked about in other podcasts. It also takes into account biochemistry. Now, you don't have to be a biochemist to at least appreciate the basics of biochemistry, but understanding what's going on biochemically that could play a role in criminal behavior in some cases, like hormonal dysfunction, neurotransmitter issues, gut-brain health problems, inflammation, blood sugar dysregulation, things of that nature. This field of research also talks about behavioral genetics, psychophysiology, which has a lot to do with like heart rate variability, skin conductive testing. But it's important to point out, in this research also says we don't want to forget about the social, the family, the environmental factors that, Joe, you're such an expert on with the R&R model. So we've talked about this many times. We don't want people to stop doing the good work they're doing with the R&R model and all those things. But in my opinion, Joe, disagree with me, but if you continue using the R&R model, wonderful. But if you were to start infusing some of the neurocriminology literature into what you're doing, it might only enhance outcomes. And why I say that, I don't think we can go wrong learning about the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala. I think you would do well learning about blood sugar dysregulation, sleep deprivation, circadian rhythm misalignment, the gut-brain health axis, to name a few. I mean, that helps us better understand human behavior at a deeper level. So that's a really broad spectrum overview of neurocriminology. And I do believe that if we put our neurocriminology hat on today, it might help shed a little more light on this really complex case. Joe, I'll kick it back to you.
I'm glad you mentioned the fact that you did a little bit of research and you didn't see a lot of educational or certificate programs talking about this. I was going to save this for the end to give it its plug, but I'm thinking let's give it its due diligence and talk about it at the top of the show here. Your neurocriminology informed professional certificate, which would give individuals, listeners, a chance to get a leg up on this emerging topic. And as you said, use it as an adjunct, if you will, to your full-time job, for lack of a better term, or your current framework, whether that's the Risk Need Responsivity framework for those of you in corrections or whatnot. I should point out that, as you said, Jerrod, we're not talking about moving away from your current mindset, if you will, but rather simply leveling up. And I know I've talked to Dr. Bonta about this, and indeed, if you read the Psychology of Criminal Conduct, they talk about brain science and brain physiology in that text. I think we just get so hyper-focused, though, on those principles of risk, need, and responsivity that we sometimes neglect to remember that Bonta and Andrews did incorporate a more holistic approach than a lot of folks who haven't read that text actually consider. But yes, Jerrod, why don't you give a plug to that program? And I want to give a shout out to a listener down in Australia, my dear friend Tammy Lewis, who is currently enrolled in the program. So folks from around the world can partake of this. It is, as Jerrod is about to tell us, an asynchronous distance education program. So take it away, Jerrod, and let folks know about this amazing opportunity.
Yeah, I developed an online continuing education certification program that's called Neurocriminology Informed Professional. Basically, the reason why I title it that is I don't want to give the impression that folks take this are going to be an expert in neurocriminology, but you're going to be more informed. And this is offered through the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. I'm the CEO and founder of that organization. And this certification program encompasses 14 different online trainings that are asynchronous. Each is 3 hours. And if people take this, they're going to learn about prenatal and postnatal traumas and what prenatal and early childhood factors could play a role in problematic behavior. There's a module on executive dysfunction. Another training focuses on self-regulation deficits. I have another one on the central nervous system, the HPA axis, social cognition deficits, which in that training you would learn about like moral reasoning, theory of mind, mentalization, and a number of other topics. There's a module on alexithymia. We have one on complex developmental trauma, the ACEs research, and another one on the gut-brain health axis. And I have one that's focused on neurotransmitter dysfunction and neurohormones, and we have one as well on nutritional deficiencies, because that does play a role in some cases. So like energy drink consumption, sugar-sweetened beverage, malnutrition, food insecurity, the Western diet would be talked about in there. And then we have one on abnormal psychophysiological responsivity. So that's basically what's going on at the physiological level. And then the final module in this program focuses on criminal recidivism through a neurocriminology and forensic psychological lens. So I think the program is very multidisciplinary. And I think people are going to learn a ton of new things you may have never, ever heard about in your undergrad, graduate, or even doctorate level programs. And there'll be a lot of things in here you probably heard about that will just reinforce the good work you're already doing.
I can point out, Jerrod, I'm currently enrolled in the program. And to your point, as I go through the content, I keep saying to myself, how did I not know this as a practicing probation officer? How did I not know this as somebody in the field of corrections? So I think folks are going to be really surprised and happy that they tiptoed into this new sphere of learning. You're really going to up your game with your clients and your stakeholders. All right, let's start unpacking the topic du jour, Charles Whitman.
Yes, Charles Whitman, born 1941, died in 1966, so an older case. He was referred to as the Texas Tower Sniper. He would be considered a mass murderer if we look at the definition nowadays. He would be considered a family homicide offender as well. Really fascinating case. If you look at like media descriptions of him, documentaries, he was referred to as a monster, a madman, a murderer, a psychopath. But also, if you look at some of these reports too, people said he was a nice person. He loved his mom. He loved his wife. He was pleasant to be around. He was handsome. He was hardworking. So you will hear two different kinds of stories about him. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this case because it's been around. It's been talked about so many times over. But if you're not familiar with the case, it involved the University of Texas at Austin, and it was considered one of the first well-known college shootings in the United States. By all accounts, he killed 16 people, injured 31, and interestingly, one of his victims actually died from effects that occurred several decades prior in 2001. This is an interesting case because prior to him engaging in this horrendous act, he actually reached out for help to a psychiatrist. He was starting to have overwhelming violent impulses, started to have like rage control issues, a lot of confusion, and a lot of headaches before this event actually took place. Hang on to that because we're going to talk about what could have been going on that maybe contributed to those feelings. He, again, was considered a mass murderer. So just being aware, if you look at the definition of mass murders now, it could involve 3 or more victims. Sometimes you look at definitions, it could involve 4 or more victims. That typically the incident takes place in a very short period of time, typically hours, in some cases days. In mass homicide events, if you look at the research in the United States, they may seem like they're more widespread, which any mass murder event, one is too many. But if you look at all the homicides that take place in the U.S., less than 1% of all homicides would be classified as a mass murder event. If you look at some of the older literature, and I know, Joe, you're familiar with Holmes and Holmes' work, but Holmes and Holmes developed a typology of mass murders several decades ago. Just to give your audience a brief overview, there's one that's called a pseudo commando. This person is more obsessed with like weapons. There's a disciple follower. There's a family annihilator, which he did murder his mother and his wife prior to the mass murder event on the college campus. There is a type of mass murder typology called a religious killer, a disgruntled citizen, a set-and-run killer, a psychotic mass killer, and a youthful school shooter. These are the typologies developed by Holmes and Holmes. So when we think about this particular case, obviously very, very tragic, just a fascinating case if we look at it through a neurocriminology lens. Because again, if you look at his life history, way different than these other individuals we profile. These other individuals we profile, Joe, obviously are serial killers. He would not be classified as a serial killer. So prior to this event, there was a lot of planning going on. And when he ended up going to the tower and ended up shooting a number of individuals, he brought up multiple weapons, hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He brought up food and water. He brought up toiletries. He brought up a radio. So there was a lot of thinking and a lot of planning going on. So the question sometimes comes up, well, if he did all of this planning, was he not 100% responsible for his actions? And the free will debate does come up. I'm not here to convince anyone about did he have all the responsibility in the world, or did he not? But I want to plant seeds of just getting us to question different things. Think about this through that neurocriminology lens. So, Joe, I'm going to stop there just for a second to see if you have any thoughts about him, his background, anything I said you want me to go a little bit deeper into.
Well, I was just curious, Jerrod, and I know you pointed out that technically Whitman was not a serial killer, but in your research, I know we always like to talk about the precursors, or as I refer to them sometimes, those pathways into crime and delinquency. Did anything strike you as different when you looked at those precursors between Whitman and, say, some of the other traditional serial killers that we looked at on the program, or is that just are those pathways and precursors simply too complex to differentiate?
Yeah, I mean, there's some similarities between him and some of the people we profiled, but there's a lot of differences too. I'll give you a couple things. So if you look at Charles Whitman's early life history, he became, by all accounts, everything I've learned, one of the youngest Eagle Scouts in the United States at that time. So he was highly intelligent in terms of an IQ score. He was involved in different sporting events. He was in the Marines. He volunteered. There's a lot of different things that he did that were very positive. But growing up, we'll talk about his father. His father was a very hardcore individual that did abuse him and his mother. He lived in a two-parent household growing up. He was involved in multiple extracurricular activities. By all accounts, did well in school. So we need to take all of these things into account. He played the piano. He was involved in a baseball team. But a few things to think about with his early childhood: exposure to domestic violence, witnessing mom and dad perpetrating domestic violence against his mother. His dad was very, very critical and really pushed the kids to be almost perfect. And his father also introduced all of the kids to firearms at a young age and really pushed them into becoming very proficient with the use of firearms. And Charles Whitman at an early age started to develop a fascination with different kinds of firearms because of hunting. But with his history, I think it's very important to really look at it through that neurocriminological lens, because let's take into account, were there any genetic factors to consider? There was one article I read, and it's not widely talked about in the literature pertaining to Charles Whitman, but one author did bring up prenatal trauma as a potential factor, and a different kind of prenatal trauma that we don't necessarily think about. This particular article and author, and I believe it was a doctoral dissertation, where the student talked about during pregnancy, Charles Whitman's mother was likely exposed to domestic violence. So during pregnancy, she was dealing with a high level of toxic stress exposure, which may have contributed to maybe some altered stress hormones in the body during development. And if we just look at the general factors in the literature that may contribute to problematic, adverse prenatal developmental outcomes, and by no means am I saying all of these things were going on with Charles Whitman's mom, but just think about this. What are the factors that could contribute? Nutritional habits, you always need to take that into account, what was going on nutritionally during pregnancy. Maternal obesity needs to be taken into account. And again, I have no idea if Charles Whitman's mother was dealing with this, but if you were to apply some of this to your cases now, we need to take into account any kind of trauma that might have been going on during pregnancy. We need to also take into account prenatal substance use exposure, tobacco, any kind of medications. These are all things that could have an impact on fetal development. And if you were to start to maybe infusing a little bit of neurocriminology literature into your screening process, And it's difficult. Let's say you're working with adult populations. You might not ever be able to find out these prenatal factors because maybe the client you're working with doesn't know their birth parents and was thrusted into the child welfare arena or termination of parental rights at a very early age. But always, in my opinion, take into account prenatal factors. Start there if you can get the data. And if you were to start screening routinely, asking questions about maybe different kinds of pre-birth challenges that could have been going on. So financial challenges during pregnancy, something to be aware of. Socioeconomic status, poverty, homelessness. What about chronic long-term unemployment or housing instability or even exposure to violence? Not just in the home, but in the community during pregnancy can give us a better idea that maybe that pregnancy was full of a lot of stress and trauma and adversity. We also need to be aware of the topic of mental health challenges. Was mom during pregnancy dealing with a lot of mental health challenges? Maybe she didn't have access to transportation. Maybe she was in a domestic violence situation where she couldn't leave the house. So what comes into mind there? Did she have lack of prenatal care? Did she not take care or go to the doctors and have proper prenatal care? These are just a few general things you maybe want to apply if you started to look through like a prenatal lens.
I love what you talked about here, Jerrod, and I think this is a good illustration of why we do these profiles and case studies on the show. It's not to second guess or compare and contrast, but just really show that there's different lenses to view our populations through. So, for example, with Mr. Whitman, I like to think sometimes that whether it's a probation violation or, in this case, an offense, or for our caseloads, I guess, or reoffense, I like to take the approach of almost how, for example, when there's a plane crash and the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, comes in and they sort of reverse engineer the crash, what happened, they look for the black box. That's kind of what I think we're doing here. So, for example, I could look at the Charles Whitman case after these shootings through a risk need responsivity lens, and I know we're sort of just doing this for demonstrative purposes, but I would take a wager that really his highest risk domains would be in that area of family dysfunction, which you've articulated. But he would score pretty low, I would assume, in the domains of education, employment, leisure and recreation activities, alcohol, drug use, those other traditional benchmarks. But when we broaden our lens, which is really all we're encouraging folks here to do on the show, you brought up, hey, what happens if we look at his prenatal trauma? Or what happens if we just look at this through an ACEs lens, those adverse childhood experiences? Or I've learned so much from you, Jerrod. For example, if we were to look at this through the HPA axis lens, what might that tell us? Jerrod, I love talking about HPA axis. Can you give a sort of your 2-minute version of what that is for listeners? Because I think it's really important, and it's one of these things that once we introduce it to our listeners, they might start thinking, yes, this is something else I've got to put in my tool belt.
The HPA axis stands for the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. It is a hormone regulator. And why do you want to care about hormones? Because hormones influence our thinking, our mood, our behavior, our energy, our sleep, our digestion. So pretty important. And it's part of our endocrine system. So you'd want to study that. And it really is a stress regulator. It's one of our stress response systems. So we all have it. And when it's working properly under a stressful situation, it kicks in. The byproduct, the end product of the axis is cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Cortisol is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But too much cortisol is bad, and not enough cortisol can be bad. So here's an example. If you've worked with clients with a long-standing history of childhood trauma or even prenatal trauma, that stress response system likely gets turned on frequently. Joe, you and I, maybe the stress response system gets kicked on here and there. Very normal. We all have stress. But if you're working with someone that grew up and there was horrific traumas, that system may get activated every day, several times a day, year after year after year. So that cortisol is kicking out over and over and over again. Over time, like anything, you turn it on and you run it too much, it can almost kind of short fuse and not work properly anymore. So then eventually, in some cases, during a stress response, the client's cortisol levels may not secrete normally, so they have low cortisol levels over time. Low levels of cortisol and having a low stress response is very problematic as well. Look at fearlessness theory, look at low heart rate variability, and look at low skin conductive levels. If you ever study psychopathy or callous and unemotional traits, there's some literature that points to the fact that people that may fall under that umbrella may actually have a very low stress response and not respond to traditional forms of treatment or traditional forms of punishment because they just don't get afraid about things. So, and a lot of times that could look like empathy deficits, which it could be empathy deficits. It could contribute to moral reasoning impairments. By no means am I saying if you work with someone with having horrific traumas, that equals psychopathy or callous and unemotional traits. I'm not saying that. But if you work with people with trauma, chronic drug and alcohol use, or even people that just deal with chronic obesity or sleep problems or just don't take care of themselves, there's tons and tons of studies that show that HPA axis is not working properly. And through a forensic lens, there's actually several studies that show that HPA axis dysfunction could be more common among really chronic offenders, violent offenders. So if you become trauma informed, you should become HPA axis informed, but you're not going to ever find a training that I've found. But don't worry, we're talking more about it, and we are offering programming in that. So
when I learned all about HPA axis, and you did a good job of sort of talking about the trilogy there of the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands. But I taught myself to think of it almost as, if folks can relate to that negative feedback loop. I think of, for example, my thermostat in my home, where it knows in the wintertime when it gets too cold, drops below a certain degrees, kick the heater on. But then when the heat in the house is sufficient, it knows, okay, that negative feedback loop kicks in. We're up to 72 degrees or whatever. Turn the heater off. But with HPA axis dysregulation, the brain doesn't get that message, and those cortisol levels keep rising and rising and rising. That regulation is out of whack. Exactly. And again, so fascinating for folks in corrections to learn about this. I really encourage you to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's a great topic. If you've ever heard of adrenal fatigue, it really is HPA axis fatigue. If you've ever heard about the fight, flight, or freeze response, I mean, that's HPA axis stuff going on. So, and it's not just someone has HPA axis dysfunction. Our whole body's interconnected. So HPA axis communicates with other parts of the brain and body. So the more we can learn about that, the more we can help the body become regulated. And we can help the body become regulated by getting better sleep, managing stress more effectively, eating better, exercising, deep breathing, mindfulness, yoga. I mean, the list goes on. It's all common sense things. So, and also often, Joe, I'm sure the work I've done in probation and corrections, how many of our clients smoke cigarettes, don't eat healthy, deal with tons of stress, can't manage their stress. I mean, that throws off their whole body, and it absolutely can have an impact on the HPA axis.
Hey, Jerrod, you did a great job linking when you talked about low stress response to things that probation, parole, corrections officials might recognize, such as empathy deficits or even psychopathy. But talk about high stress response. Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't that when people are always in that sort of reactive stage, and that can also be attributed to those heightened levels of cortisol?
Absolutely. We should probably think of like temperament can play a role. Like I'm pretty laid back and I'm a huge introvert. You may know people who are outgoing and go, 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 go. That can play a role. Family factors can play a role in this. A child grows up in a home and they're being modeled by parents how to manage stress effectively, or is that child in a home and during stress that parent just loses it and screams? That can activate the HPA axis and it can be crazy making over time. If you use trauma-informed care approaches, motivational interviewing, attachment-based approaches, things that are using empathy, attunement, validation, just think, how do you feel when people treat you that way? You probably feel calmer, more relaxed, validated. You feel more heard. You feel more known. So your body probably works better as well. Have you ever been around someone who minimizes you and you bring up a concern and they just brush you aside or they talk down to you? What do you feel in your body? You probably have a stress response. If that happens over and over and over again, and the same can be applied to if you work in an environment where you're around coworkers who are pretty harsh and brutal and mean, or you have a boss who's just not too fun to be around, all those burnout symptoms are linked to more HPA axis issues and cortisol issues and all kinds of things. So it's not just for the client, it's for all of us too to be aware.
Yeah, we love talking about the parallel processes on this show, Jerrod, and that's a great reminder. It's not just about the clients, it's about us as well.
Well, back to Charles Whitman too, and Joe, you probably have a lot to say about this, but the topic of social learning theory is discussed in the Whitman literature because he grew up in a home and his father modeled violent behavior, aggressive behavior. So we need to take into account social learning theory. In some articles that talk about Whitman, the question comes up, what role did genetics play? I have no idea, but it is just something for us to think about. And if we look through that neurocriminology lens, genetics, behavioral genetics is talked about in that literature. So genetics, behavioral genetics, epigenetics, intergenerational transmissions of trauma should be considered. Fascinating field of study is just learning about behavioral genetics. And some people have probably heard like the warrior gene or the MAOA gene, something to just learn about. I'm not saying Charles Whitman had that at all, but it is something. What role did genetics play? Another factor I think we need to take into account, and this is mentioned one time, and it's not a peer-reviewed article, but I think it was like a newspaper story or magazine report where they interviewed somebody that I believe was a doctor or a psychiatrist or someone who specialized in like play. And this author talked about, did play deprivation factor into this at all? And they brought up the question, Charles Whitman grew up in a home with an overbearing father. How much playtime did he get as a kid with his father? It's just something for us to think about. It's really fascinating literature because if you look at the research of today, child play plays a critical role in healthy brain development, physical development, empathy, attunement, emotional regulation. So the takeaway point is looking at play therapy, maybe referring a client to play therapy, understanding how play absolutely promotes cooperation skills, empathy, growing up. If you look at some of the literature on play deprivation and the ACEs research, a child grew up in a home and maybe they were never held. They never like played on the ground and played make-believe with trucks or toys or outside with a caregiver. In some cases, that could be linked to more problematic behaviors. And again, it's difficult to say if that played any role in this case, but it was something, at least for us to think about as well. This is where it gets interesting as well. Prior to the actual mass murder event, Charles Whitman was obsessed with note-taking. This is where it gets into the weeds with like neuroscience. He started becoming really obsessed with note-taking, journaling his thoughts. And you want to be aware of the term hypergraphia. Hypergraphia is more of a behavioral condition where people start having a really intense desire to journal or write or draw. They have this overwhelming urge to write. And it's a really fascinating topic. And why is it fascinating in his case? Because, and we'll talk about this in a minute, after Whitman was shot and killed, and he died in the event after he committed the acts, he actually requested that after his death, there's an autopsy to be done on his brain because he did not know why he was having all of these rage control issues. And during the autopsy, they actually found a small tumor in his brain that was pushing against his amygdala. And if you're not familiar with the amygdala, that is part of our limbic system, and you will find tons of articles that talk about amygdala dysfunction within the context of emotional dysregulation, criminality in some cases, and that obsessive need to write has sometimes been associated with amygdala dysfunction. So, Joe, we should absolutely do a talk on the amygdala. So if you ever study criminality from a neuroscience lens, you hear me talk a lot about the prefrontal cortex executive function. It's equally important to understand the amygdala. Very fascinating topic because the amygdala is also, it really plays a role in social judgment, moral emotion. You can also find plenty of studies that talk about the amygdala and the HPA axis, how they work together hand in hand. The amygdala also plays a role in oxytocin, which is a neurohormone that's really related to empathy and things of that nature. So really fascinating topic. So that is why in this research, the topic of free will does come up. And I don't know where I fall yet on that. I would probably never know, but he had a tumor that pushed against the amygdala. Did that contribute to his actions? Some say yes, some say no. There are some people that believe that he did not have a tumor. Other people just simply believe that he did it all willfully and there should not be any excuse for his actions. So, but if we were to dig through that neurocriminology lens, what do we know now that's going on with his history? Possible prenatal exposure to a lot of stress, because if mom was dealing with domestic violence during pregnancy, something to take into account. Overbearing, rigid father, witnessed domestic violence growing up. His father really pushed his kids to the brink of perfectionism. So what stress does that put on a child? The play deprivation, could that be a factor? I don't know if that was going on. The fascination with guns, another factor. The tumor in the brain on the amygdala. This is why I feel like this case really was helpful looking at it through that neurocriminology lens. So a couple other things, Joe, that I don't know, I don't think would relate to this, but I think it would start a conversation. During the actual mass shooting event, the temperature at that time was horrendous. Very, very, very warm. By no means am I saying this played any role, but if you look at the weather-crime relationship, really fascinating. Extreme weather temperatures, there's several studies that show that extreme heat exposure could play a role in some cases of violent behavior. And if you look deep in the weeds with the weather and the heat-related literature, it talks about dehydration, heat exhaustion, an increase in possible mental health symptoms, irritability, sleep issues, fatigue, lower stress tolerance. It's tough to know because I have no idea if Whitman was dehydrated, if he was dealing with heat exhaustion prior to the event as well. Did that play just a slight role? I don't know, but it is something just for us to kind of chew on and think about. And if we were to apply the neuroscience research of today and apply it to his case, again, looking at neuroscience literature, it's vast. But when you study neuroscience, you're really focused on understanding the various structures and the functions of the brain, including the nervous system. And you really take into account psychology research, biochemistry, physiology, developmental research, brain anatomy. And if you study neuroscience of today, You probably want to understand neurotransmitters, mirror neurons, neuroplasticity. The list goes on and on and on. So really fascinating. And if you start infusing like neuroscience literature into what you do in terms of your intake, your PSI, your cog skills groups, neuroscience research can help us better understand how clients learn, read, and write. We can help better understand why they may have attention or memory problems. It can play a role in helping us better understand emotions and self-regulation and language and social decision-making. The list goes on and on. Joe, I'll park it there for a minute, see thoughts.
Jerrod, I loved your input about not excusing the actions, but rather looking for an opportunity to learn from it. And you brought up social learning theory earlier. This case is a great illustration of, I think, what you and I are all about when we do these profiles. It's just taking an all of the above approach to examine past behaviors to hopefully inform us on decision making to prevent future behaviors. So, for example, most probation officers should at least know that the Risk Need Responsivity framework is really predicated on Bonton Andrews' general personality and cognitive social learning theory, which is really based on Al Bandura's social learning theory. So in the case of Charles Whitman, could we look at this through the lens of social learning theory, through that R&R framework, and attribute his actions to the criminogenic domain of family dysfunction? As you said, the father modeling violence in the household. Yeah, that would check that social learning theory box. But it doesn't mean that it also won't check other boxes, say, for example, the neurocriminology box that, there may have been a tumor on the amygdala. Does that contradict anything in social learning theory? No. But does it also perhaps explain? Yes. Just like we could take that same lens with the prenatal domestic violence that his mother was going through. Does that negate social learning theory or the fact that there may have been a tumor on the amygdala? No. But does it help piece together more clues explaining his behavior? Yes. We shouldn't be exclusionary when we're trying to decipher, if we're deciphering for the purpose of learning. And to that end, Jerrod, I want to mention that when you were talking about your neurocriminology informed professional program and really just neurocriminology in general, it's also about assessment and interventions. It's not just reactive like we're sort of doing here, but it can also be embraced proactively. So maybe talk about some interventions and or assessments that could have been used for the Whitman case, if we're just staying in our make-believe world here, that could have been used in the hands of a practitioner to maybe alter that pathway.
So in the Whitman literature, there's one article talks about, was Whitman a victim of biology? Fascinating just to think about. Is that a possibility? What they say, I mean, obviously the free will debate comes up, the tumor. I mean, I don't think it's just the tumor, obviously, that played a role there. But if we look at the general research literature in terms of what biological factors are talked about that may play a partial role in criminality, antisocial behavior, violent behavior, poor nutrition is talked about. So looking at your case, is your client only consuming sugar-sweetened beverages, energy drinks for breakfast every day and skipping meals, and at lunch they're going through the drive-thru or going to the gas station and getting processed foods? And are they dealing with malnutrition, food insecurity? So that's a factor to take into account. We've talked about this before, and we're not advocating for you to go out and give advice about, hey, take this vitamin or this mineral or set up this meal plan. But maybe if you're hearing these themes, refer the client to a qualified nutritionist. Did your client deal with any exposure to drugs, alcohol, tobacco, lots and lots of trauma or stress in utero? Was there any kind of birth complications? That's talked about in this literature. So if you can get access to birth records, that can help us better understand. In this literature, too, it talks about, was there exposure to any environmental toxins? If you're working with clients that have lived in poverty or homelessness for a long, long period of time, Take into account air pollution exposure. Were they ever exposed to lead or mercury or any kind of other environmental contaminants that can absolutely impact our endocrine system, aka our hormones and our HPA axis? Think about, too, chronic sleep deprivation. Maybe you're working with clients that just don't sleep well. What about head trauma histories, ruling out any kind of trauma histories to the brain, which could indicate prefrontal cortex issues, amygdala dysfunction? Joe, you talked about the ACEs research, becoming adverse childhood experiences informed and attachment informed. So those would be just a few things to apply, I think, to any case if we were to then start looking at it through that neurobiopsychosocial hat. And you talked about the social learning theory. Absolutely take that into account, the R&R model. But if you start considering some of these other biological, neurological factors, I think it's going to help us get deeper in the weeds and helping us understand our clients' behaviors more on a holistic level. And it may create a little more empathy in us and understanding too, which may help us better understand why treatment as usual, probation practices as usual, sentencing decisions as usual aren't working for this client. Why do they violate over and over and over again? They can't hold a job. They can't seem to get to their appointments. Could there be something going on biologically with them? Could there be something going on neurologically? In a high percentage of cases, if you're working with long-term offenders, I feel comfortable saying, yes, there's probably something going on neurologically and or biologically, as well as some of those social and environmental factors.
And I think it's important to point out, Jerrod, that we love, for example, pushing the traditional cognitive behavioral interventions and cognitive behavioral trainings on this program. But I think there's really a hand-in-glove fit with those approaches and neurocriminology, as long as you couple that with a broader understanding of what you've been talking about, the context, and realizing, okay, I may need to augment this with a little bit of mindfulness training. So, for example, if you're just making the great point of why do I keep having these probation violations with this client or recidivism rates? Well, maybe the understanding that if you're simply going through the motions with these cognitive behavioral interventions, whether it's, say, for example, it's in a group setting, and let's say, for example, it might even be a group that you're running in a correctional facility, and all of the clients come into the room, but they're teed off about something that went down in the jail, or let's say it's even in the community, and they all report for their Tuesday night thinking for a change or decision points group or whatever off-the-shelf curricula it may be, but they're bonkers about something in the news. There was a shooting or a this or a that. They're not up in the prefrontal cortex where they need to be for these interventions to have any traction. But if the practitioner doesn't know that, then they may ask, why aren't these interventions working?
And if I put my neurocriminology hat on, then we've talked kind of this example on break from the cog skills group or whatever group it is. Are they outside smoking? Are they outside drinking a sugar sweetened beverage or an energy drink? And then prior to them coming to your group, have they been up all night because they worked the night shift? And now we're talking about maybe some blood sugar dysregulation. Maybe we're talking about chronic sleep deprivation. Maybe there's some circadian rhythm misalignment, which is common among people that work shift jobs or overnight jobs. And with all of those factors, are they dealing with a lot of stress, which is probably indicative of some digestive health issues, which is very, very common. So now we maybe have increases in blood sugar dysregulation, digestive health issues, chronic sleep deprivation, and all of those things increase inflammation in the body. So through my neurobiochemical hat, those would be maybe just a few other variables that could help explain why that client can't sit still. They're not taking in information. They just seem to be more aggressive or more impulsive. Those are a few things you'd want to consider.
And even I should point out, if a probation officer is doing even one-on-one cognitive behavioral interventions, it's crucial that you understand the importance of knowing where that client's headspace is before you go into those interventions. I'm just leery that sometimes we get into this almost bean counter mentality that we have leadership or administrations saying, yeah, we're doing the interventions, but we're just checking that box. I'm thinking of, say, for example, you could have a very well-intentioned school teacher, but with an very unruly classroom. And if they're just standing in front of the classroom reading from the transparencies or the PowerPoint and the kids are just going bonkers, yeah, you could check the box and say, I read this lecture today, but there's no learning taking place, which is really what you're doing with these cognitive behavioral interventions. You're think of yourself as a teacher more than a probation officer in those moments. And you've got to set the table for establishing that ideal learning environment. It's the responsivity principle, really.
Can I say one more thing about that learning environment? So if you look at it through a neuroscience lens, half your clients probably have a head injury, if you believe what the research says. And if you study it through that lens, what happens if your client has working memory deficits, sensory processing issues, or slow processing speed? So if someone has working memory deficits, that's their brain's Post-it note. If you're up there lecturing and talking about a lot of things at once or multitasking, that overwhelms their brain. And if they have sensory overload, they get overwhelmed, they shut down, they could shut down and look like they're falling asleep. They could be more fidgety and run out of the room. If you have a lot of bright lights in there, people are wearing cologne or perfume, that can overwhelm someone with sensory issues. And if someone has processing speed weaknesses, they may not be able to take in a lot of words in a timely manner. So it's a traffic jam in their brain. So sometimes cog skills groups may not be appropriate for some of these clients because of their brain-based impairments. They may do a lot better with one-on-one interventions, even though a lot of probation and a lot of court-related sentencing decisions are usually pretty prescribed, at least in my experience. Like everyone has to go to this group or do that group. That may actually set up that client for failure unintentionally. I don't think the courts are doing it intentionally. They just might not have a lot of this awareness. So individualizing the approach. And one other thing, what happens if that client is 40 years old chronologically who's referred to the group, and they're in a group with a bunch of other 40-year-olds, but that one client has a brain of a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old? They're going to be lost in the shuffle. They might be more gullible or naive and impressionable. So those are a few things to take into account when you look at it through that neuroscience lens as well.
Jerrod, I loved when you made the point, and I agree, the courts are well-intentioned, but when they make these recommendations sometimes, I think it's part of the human condition of, well, it worked, let's replicate it. I was reflecting on this the other day about, say, for example, in Hollywood, there's a hit movie, and what do all the studios do? They just crank out a bunch of copycat crappy movies that try to capture lightning in a bottle again. And I think sometimes in corrections, we do that same thing. We see a promising intervention, but we go all in and think, oh, this is going to be the one size fits all for all of our clients. And we're well intentioned, but we don't practice enough due diligence, and we don't individualize and contextualize those interventions and realize that, hey, our clients are complex human beings with complex risk and complex needs, and what worked for one client and what might work indeed for many, many clients may not work for your client if you keep too many of those blinders on and don't subscribe to a lot of the things that Jerrod and I have been talking about here, which is get the holistic view of that client's history and really try to contextualize those interventions.
Great. Excellent points, Joe. Thank you.
Jerrod, what's left with Mr. Whitman here? I see the clock on the wall. Any concluding thoughts?
Well, I think it just creates a lot of questions, which is good. I love having more questions because it forces me to dig deeper. And in this particular case, when preparing for it, I didn't know a lot about hypographia, so now I'm a little more informed. I learned something new. So any case that I try to dig deeper into, I'm always going to try to stay curious and at least try to learn one or two new things that might be applied to something else. So the takeaway point is a lot of moving parts with his case. The free will debate comes up, moral responsibility, culpability, all of these things. Again, think about this. I think this is a great discussion if you're ever teaching an ethics class or a neuroethics class, or just you're having discussions about like responsibility and moral reasoning and ethics. This would be a great case study, I think, just to present to students and get people to think deeper. What could be going on prenatally? Genetics, brain tumor, social learning theory, fascination with guns. What role did any role play with the temperature in here? Perfectionistic behaviors. I mean, the list goes on and on. So a lot of interesting talking points in this case, I think.
And again, as we've been saying, Jerrod, just to really not second guess oneself, but almost look at it as a way to learn and move forward. Put your Sherlock Holmes hat on and maybe ask yourself what you could pick up from that case to leverage in future cases. I made a note on hypergraphia as well, Jerrod, so great minds must think alike here. I'm going down that rabbit hole this weekend. Dr. Brown, I will leave links to your neurocriminology informed professional program via our good friends at APHIS in the episode description of this podcast, and any other relevant links. I know you've also got a great program at Concordia, your trauma, resilience, and self-care program. Do you want to give a quick shout out to that program as well?
Yeah, we have two emphasis tracks, the trauma, resilience, self-care. We have a track in forensic behavioral health and fully online programs, asynchronous. And we talk a lot about trauma, brain injuries, mental health, prenatal factors, drug and alcohol issues. We look at it through this multidisciplinary lens. We have students in here from all over the country, from all walks of life, probation, corrections, law enforcement, mental health, human service. But I really feel like it's a great program, and we help people think deeper in terms of understanding complex human behavior, understanding criminality, but also understanding victimization, the role of the family, and all of these things. And feel free to share my contact information, Joe, with folks. And I'm more than happy to chat with folks by phone or email.
I will certainly do so. And I would presume that if you're listening to this podcast, it's because you're in that camp of individuals who enjoy thinking deeper. So I encourage you to check out any and all of the offerings that Dr. Brown has to offer. Jerrod, until next time, my friend, I'm looking forward to future discussions in this fascinating topic.
Thank you, Joe, again. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, and hope you all have a great day.
Take care, Jerrod.
Thank you.
Our thanks to Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University in St. Paul, and of course, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. Please check out the episode description of this program to discover all of the related links which we referenced in this show, including information on the amazing Neurocriminology informed professional program that Jerrod's all about, as well as the programs offered through Concordia University related to trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies. Lots of good stuff for you adult learners that want to keep on pushing yourselves and upping your professional game. To that end, for those of you who may be thinking to yourselves, Joe, this is great. Thank you for leveling us up, if you will, from perhaps our baseline risk need responsivity framework. And we, of course, love talking about any and all things related to the topic of desistance from crime and merging those two approaches, the one looking at pathways into crime and the other looking at those pathways out of crime. And recently, of course, we've been augmenting our talks, looking at an individual's trajectory, but also considering more of a trauma-informed care perspective. And today, Dr. Brown talking all about neurocriminology. And so you may be saying to yourself, Joe, lots on our plates. Help us, how could you say, operationalize and cobble all of these domains together? If you're asking yourself that question, continue listening. We want to remind you all that my good friend and colleague, Nicole Staley, have been working on our trauma-informed desistance program model, and we are ready to partner with any and all agencies looking to embrace all of these themes and bundle them into a package which we feel will most holistically assess and treat those individuals on our caseloads. Nicole's going to be on the show in a couple of weeks talking all about our TIDES program, but keep on listening and know that help is on the way for those of you that want some real practical applications for applying all of this knowledge into a model which we feel is really, really unique. So stay tuned for that. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, program design, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. You can also go to theparagongroup.llc.com to discover all of our back episodes of the Criminologist podcast. It's a great way to get caught up on what you've missed. If you have any questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the program, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
If you continue using the R&R model, wonderful. But if you were to start infusing some of the neurocriminology literature into what you're doing, it might only enhance outcomes. And why I say that? I don't think we can go wrong learning about the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala. I think you would do well learning about blood sugar dysregulation, sleep deprivation, circadian rhythm misalignment, the gut-brain health axis, to name a few. I mean, that helps us better understand human behavior at a deeper level.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.